everyone, and welcome to Latest Pages. This is my first video in a brand new series where we analyze Edexcel A-level poetry. So this is basically the poetry anthology poems of the decade, and today we're talking about Chainsaw versus the Pampas Grass by Simon Armitage. So you might know me from my GCSE content before, but the GCSE board that I was doing was CIE. So with Edexcel, it's a little bit different and there's not much of a focus on context. However, I do think that context is important, so I will just say a brief note that Simon Armitage is a British poet. He was born in Yorkshire, I believe. He holds the position of Poet Laureate, which basically means he's the national poet of Britain. He's basically tasked with writing important poems for special events. Chainsaw versus the Pampas Grass first appeared in Armitage's 2002 volume, and it tackles such themes as man versus nature, gender roles, and social class. It uses the mundane to address the universal, as on the surface it's a very simple tale of a man who wants to cut the Pampas grass in his backyard. Why do I say that this is a man, even though the speaker is never explicitly named? Because there is something of traditional male and female roles in the poem. Armitage plays on these traditional stereotypes to criticize hegemonic masculine behavior that leads to toxic masculinity or aggression or violence, or encourages things like drinking and being part of the buddies that don't respect women, and elevating one's status and a sense of physical competition. Gender roles are a consistent theme of discussion, along with class and with the man versus nature theme, like I mentioned previously. And as we go through the poem and I analyze it stanza by stanza, I would like to draw attention to all of these themes because I think it helps to see the multiple interpretations that we have. And so the man prepares his chainsaw for the battle, and at first it seems like an easy victory. Of course the chainsaw is gonna win, right? I mean, it's a chainsaw, it's gearing up, newly taken out of its sleeve, it has engine oil poured into it, it's ready for battle, and the Pampas grass is just unaware, bathing in the sunlight. But as the poem progresses, we see that it is not such an easy victory, and the Pampas grass may surprise you with its resilience. First, a note on structure. The poem has 8 irregular length stanzas with no rhyme scheme and regular meter. The stanzas mainly don't have enjambments between them, meaning they don't carry over, and this gives a sense of opposition, as if there are two elements in clear conflict, which is of course the case with the grass and the chainsaw. The inconsistency in structure makes for an unsteady and unstable reading experience, similar to the way that chainsaws gear up and down, the thrumming of the engine. Furthermore, most of the lines are unstopped, meaning the poem is less fluid and natural, emphasizing that this is not nature. This is a machine that lashes out, almost cutting the reader with the sharp pauses. And we can also see that there is an element of human control over the situation. It's the human wielding the death machine against nature and giving the poem a semblance of cutting certain things, but not others, so harming those it wants to harm for the sake of its pleasure. It seemed an unlikely match. All winter unplugged, grinding its teeth in a plastic sleeve. The chainsaw swung nose down from a hook in the dark room under the hatch in the floor. When offered the can, it knocked back a quarter pint of engine oil, and juices ran from its joints and threads, oozed across the guide bar and the maker's name into the tri-links. So the use of the word match in the first line gives off several possible meanings. Of course, the obvious one of match in the sportsman-like term, because we had versus, this idea of a battle between the chainsaw and the Pampas grass. That was obvious from the very onset. From the start of the poem, we set these two on opposite ends, and we see them slowly coming together and meeting and seeing who will emerge victorious. But there is the word match in two more meanings. So first, match as in a romantic match, like the male and female romantic match here in this case, because it talks a lot about gender roles, and at some point you will see the violence that the chainsaw as the male exhibits towards female. It assaults the Pampas grass, and there is also match in the match that you can use to light a fire, and we will see that the word match take on that meaning later on. So we can see that Armitage uses certain words and they take on a different nuance as the poem progresses, which he does very well. There is nothing sportsmanlike about a completely uneven match, so this use of the word match as almost like a fair, regulated competition gives off a wry, skeptical tone from the very onset. But then, of course, we have this idea that actually it seemed an unlikely match, and seemed is in the past tense. It grabs your attention. Instantly, the reader asks, how is it possible that grass beat a chainsaw? This stanza has a lot of examples of personification, which I also think is very significant because the chainsaw transitions from being a machine to being like man, this joining of forces together to destroy nature, as we said with the case of the maker's name, and the hard G sounds in grinding its teeth. This t sound, it gives the impression of strength and almost spitting with rage. Furthermore, this plastic sleeve, it has a potential allusion to contraception because, as we will see later on throughout the poem, there are a lot of phallic images, and so it's this image that it wasn't plugged in, so it was limited in its masculinity, it was somehow stripped of its strength and dominion, it was very heavily in a cage, and so now it comes roaring out, ready to exert its power and to prove that it's manly enough. It swings nose down, it swings down ready to hurt, and it also emerges from a hook in the dark room. And this idea of emerging from the dark into the sunlight, it's again this idea of a very traditional boxing match when the champions emerge from different ends and they kind of walk into the light, and then the spotlight is on them and we all collectively watch, punch each other, and they hurt each other, and they're very much illuminated in the space. And that is exactly what the chainsaw is doing. It's making its claim as the future champion. I mentioned that the chainsaw is a symbol of masculinity before, but the Pampas grass is described at one point as having 12-foot spears, and it's this idea of a potential allusion to colonialism, with the chainsaw being the progress of man coming in to destroy the inferior human beings, to bestow progress upon people who don't necessarily want this progress, this colonialization. And so perhaps the fact that the Pampas grass ultimately emerges victorious and remains as it was before shows that the dominant culture, the ones that try to take over the less prominent culture, the minorities, is not always successful because the minorities manage to carry their culture forward. And this could potentially be an allusion to social class, because it's like the chainsaw is emerging from downstairs, from beneath the hook, from that hidden level of floorboards, phrases that people use to describe the social class over time, as this top layer is the elites, this bottom layer is the working people. And so this chainsaw is almost like a symbol of the working class because it's so like violent, and it drinks, and it's all these like negative stereotypes of the working class, and it emerges ready to fight this battle against the Pampas grass, which is so royal. It's described as royal. It bathes in the sunlight, it has all these cushions and footstools, and just indulges itself in its luxury. And so the fact that it beats the chainsaw eventually shows that the inequality gap is widening, and ultimately the rich manages to still win, because Pampas grass as a plant, it's very much a weed. Like, it takes, because it's so tall, it takes over all the resources in the area, so other plants don't really have the chance to flourish. Chainsaw is described as knocking back a quarter pint of engine oil, so the use of the phrase knocking back brings to mind someone chugging a beer, or like just an alcoholic drink, essentially. So not only is this once again an allusion to the working class, as I said previously, but alcohol is very much a symbol of uncertainty and unpredictability, because when people are drunk, they're not really in control. And so the fact that the chainsaw eagerly embraces this shows just how easily it wants to get lost in its rage, and it drinks the engine oil so passionately that it runs down its joints and threads. It's almost as if the alcohol wants to escape the inner turmoil of the chainsaw, and it runs down its joints and threads. Joints and threads, again, from the semantic field of athletics, again personifying the chainsaw, making it seem like an athlete who's drinking power smoothies and like powdered protein shakes and stuff, getting ready to fight, getting ready to beat the opponent. From the summer house, still holding one last gulp of last year's heat behind its double doors and hung with the weightless wreckage of wasps and flies, mothballed in spider's wool. From there, I trailed the Dayglow orange power line, the lengths of the lawn and the garden path, fed it out like powder from a keg, then walked back to the socket and flicked the switch, and then walked again and coupled the saw to the flex, clipped them together, then dropped the safety catch and gunned the trigger. The holding one last gulp of last year's heat is this final sense of summer. The soft haze, like this warmth, this pleasant lazy days, just bathing in the sun. This is it. This is the last of it. By opening the doors, we're letting it all out. We're merging into the big bad world that's about to become brutal. There's about to be victims. Weightless wreckage of wasps and flies, this alliteration, this wispy sound, it's almost as if this soft haze is everywhere, and then we have this journey of preparing for death, preparing for battle. So it's a very sharp juxtaposition and a very sharp contrast, and so we see that we move on from the initial stage of introducing the chainsaw to the stage of the chainsaw getting ready to fight and to prepare for the final battle. And also we understand why it really hurts the chainsaw at the end when it doesn't win, because it has done all this preparation essentially for nothing. The sense of being cleared away is also significant here, as that's essentially what the speaker wants to do. They want to do away with all their previous memories. They want to start a new life. They don't want to do it gradually. They want it to be a sharp burst of violence here and now. They want to move on and they want to completely forget about it. Get the feeling that this is a message from the poet that you can't forget the past. The past is an important part of who we are. Like, no matter how bad it is, the colonialism, the racism, all of that, we shouldn't just forget it and try to move on. Instead, we should embrace it as being part of our mistakes and make sure we don't repeat them as we progress forward. The Dayglow orange power line and the simile of like powder from a keg, it reminds us of a trail of gunpowder. The speaker is almost like Guy Fawkes stretching this line of gunpowder to blow up the parliament, and we know how that ended. So this bit of description is not only a powerful bit of foreshadowing again being something that Armitage masterfully does throughout the poem, but also again an allusion to social class, because ultimately Guy Fawkes did not bring down the parliament, he did not start a revolution and a shift in the system, and so we get the feeling that this is it, this is pointless. The speaker also describes the saw with the semantic field of weaponry, more specifically guns. So he dropped the safety catch, he gunned the trigger. He wants to have the same sharp burst of destruction that a gun does, but a chainsaw is even more brutal, it's more personal, it requires you to be up close. So the way that he sees the chainsaw as just a way to inflict sharp and sudden pain, clearly a vendetta against this Pampas grass. No gearing up or getting to speeds, just an instant rage. The rush of metal lashing out at air, connected to the mane. The chainsaw with its perfect disregard, its mood to tangle with cloth or jewelry or hair. The chainsaw with its bloody desire, its sweet tooth for the flesh of the face and the bones underneath. Its grand plan to kick back against nail or knot and rear up into the brain. I let it flare, lifted it into the sun, and felt 100 beats per second drumming in its heart, and felt the drive wheel gargle in its throat. The chainsaw starts working with instant rage. The flare of violence is immediate. The metal lashes out even at the air, like even before it's being allowed to get to the Pampas grass, which is the victim that's supposed to be the victim. There are casualties involved, suggesting that innocent victims always get hurt in the process. Applying it to a bigger theme of war, applying it to more universal themes, is the idea that world leaders generally do not care about the citizens and the casualties involved when they start a war. It's always the territory, it's always the money, it's always the long-term lasting advantages of starting a war. But how can there be advantages when war is such an act of atrocities being committed? And so seeing this chainsaw here is very reminiscent of that. To link back to the gender theme, this mood to tangle with cloth or jewelry or hair, it describes stereotypically feminine things. So this could also be taken as an image of violence against women, that men are ready to hurt women, that men are ready to pounce, and that they don't have a regard for what the woman wants. It wants to assault the grass because it seeks only to address and to attend to its bloody desires. It has a sweet tooth. It's an uncontrollable appetite for blood, a desire to consume it all, the flesh of the face. It's such a vivid description. It's almost the voice of the chainsaw, how the chainsaw thinks about it. First I'm going to cut into the face, then into the brain, then I'm going to cut down the body. It's a very sharp and vivid image, and the fricative F sounds of the flesh of the face, it gives this sputtering sound, f-f-f, but it also gives the idea of obscene swearing. Nail or knot can also be materials in this stanza, but you can see it as a rebellion against the idea of tying the knot, so of marriage, of men settling down with only one woman and having responsibilities and caring for only one woman. No, they don't want that aspect of the relationship. They don't want the emotional, they want the purely physical in this sense. And the speaker lets it flare and lift to the sun, suggesting that men idealize this idea, this traditional idea that the chainsaw represents, like the traditional masculine idea. And I can also see here the image of Icarus flying too close to the sun, another bit of foreshadowing, and the anaphora of felt the, so it makes us feel too. And the general conversational style and the flare up and kick back, it emphasizes the thesaurus and it enunciates the structure and the breaks. So when we read it, it's a very clear-cut sound with fragmented elements, and it makes the poem so much more immersive. The Pampas grass, with its ludicrous feathers and plumes. The Pampas grass, taking the warmth and light from cuttings and bulbs, sunning itself, stealing the show with its footstools, cushions, and tufts, and its 12-foot spears. I talked about the Pampas grass being more feminine and more primitive in the natural sense before, so I'll keep this section brief. These are essentially all the negative stereotypes associated with women and the rich being too preoccupied with appearance or too preoccupied with things that aren't utilitarian, things just for the sake of enjoyment. And there's a lot of sibilants in the stanza. Footstools, cushions, tufts, this sound, it gives the impression of not only something moving softly in the wind, the susurration, the rustling of the grass, but also just the softness of all of these things, of the tufts of the pampas grass, of the footstools, of the cushions, of the very, very best. And this is very much a description from the chainsaw's point of view. It's ludicrous feathers, and it's almost bitter that the pampas grass is stealing the spotlight, that the chainsaw doesn't get the attention. The chainsaw wants that attention. This is what it is preparing for. It's essentially like the male gaze, but instead it's the chainsaw gaze. This is also the first time the pampas grass is actually introduced to the reader, not just in the title, and it's being ridiculed. So again, we also have the sense that of course the chainsaw is gonna win, even though we know the outcome from the very first line. This was the sledgehammer taken to crack the nut. Probably all that was needed here was a good pull or shove, or a pitchfork to lever it out at its base. Overkill. I touched the blur of the blade against the nearmost tip of a reed. It didn't exist. I tapped at a stalk that swooned, docked a couple of heads, dismissed the top third of its canes with a sideways sweep at shoulder height. This was a game. I lifted the fringe of the undergrowth, carved at the trunk, plant juice spat from the pipes and tubes, and dust flew out as I ripped into pockets of dark secret warmth. So continuing on with the sexual connotations, we have the sledgehammer taken to crack the nut. So the pampas grass is what's ultimately gonna take control of the male organ. It's gonna dominate it. It's gonna take away this traditional idea of male power and male virility. And of course we have the plant juice spat from the pipes and tubes. Dust flew out as I ripped into pockets of dark secret warmth. We have very clear phallic images here, and this idea of the chainsaw destroying the feminine. But the roles are also strangely subverted. So the grass, even though it is the woman here, it has male organs too, with the 12-foot spears and the plant juice spat from the pipes and the tubes. And there's a suggestion that male violence doesn't only destroy the image of destroy women, but it also destroys the image of men, because ultimately this is such a harmful idea that all men are like this. So Armitage also speaks out about that if we promote this idea of traditional hegemonic masculinity that encourages such behavior towards women, we are not only harming women and asserting our control over them, but we are harming the male reputation too. There's another juxtaposition here in the way that the speaker touches and dabs very gently, but such destruction is wreaked. Again, this idea that men do not realize the havoc that they wreak, and there's something very predatory in these descriptions, like overkill, lifting the fringe. It's as if it's searching for the victim in a very playful way. It's toying with its prey, it's enjoying the whole process, it's not a matter of convenience. And there are a lot of caesures here as well. We can feel the on and off roar of the violence. This was a game and it didn't exist. In particular, break the flow of the poem. We can really hear them when we read, they stick out. And these are minor sentences, also called minor fragments. They do not have a subject in them, and it's a very harsh pause. And because there's no subject, it suggests a loss of identity. The man disappears, the human disappears, leaving only animal. To clear a space to work, I raked whatever was severed or felled or torn towards the dead zone under the outhouse wall to be fired. Then cut and raked, till what was left was a flat stump the size of a manhole cover or barrel lid that wouldn't be dug with a spade or prized from the earth. Wanting to finish things off, I took up the saw and drove it vertically downwards into the upper roots, but the blade became choked with soil or fouled with weeds, or what was spliced or split somehow closed and mended behind, like cutting at water or air with a knife. I poured barbecue fluid into the patch and threw in a match. It flamed for a minute, smoked for a minute more, and went out. I left it at that. Humanity sees nature as something of a burden and easily disposable. It takes up space. It doesn't allow us to build buildings and to build architecture and to progress. No, it's useless. Why do we need these trees for? There's no longer the sense of enjoyment. There's just the sense of let's get it done. Like, who cares? And he carelessly rakes whatever was left to the dead zone. He just scrapes all these dead bodies of nature, all these suffering plants to one side. He buries them. He conceals them. It becomes a repetitive action. He cuts and rakes, much like violence throughout history. What's left is a flat stump the size of a manhole cover. This image of leaving only the shriveled remains and covering them up. And it seems that he has won, but then there's the volta. Wanting to finish things off. The powers start to shift. Wanting to finish things off is a popular idiom, but here Armitage examines it in the actual sense that it has. So wanting to finish things off, like wanting to get rid of things completely and totally, with no room for them to regrow, with no room for them to recover, and that is ultimately what brings the victor down. The chainsaw attempts to cut vertically down, to use even more force, to get in there, to take a more direct approach. And the grass, even though so much of it has been cut down, it's a symbol of resilience, because with its last strength it resists and it sacrifices more of itself, and the chainsaw gets stuck and it can't cut anymore, and the grass comes back and it mends itself, and yes, it takes time, but it recovers. It's a slow progress, but it's a steady progress. And the simile of like cutting at water or air with a knife, it's essentially showing that it's incomparable what humanity has achieved compared to what nature has achieved. So yes, we build buildings, and yes, we got the internet, and yes, we have all this technology at our disposal, but nature has been here for many more years than we have. We are essentially a product of nature, of evolution, and so it's showing that it's like trying to fight the elements with a fork. Like, it's useless. In a desperate last attempt, the speaker lights a match and barbecue fluid, like I said previously before in the first stanza. It's again this image of something like of a stereotypically male dad activity of barbecue, but the match shifts from being a match of brute strength that seems like it's rigged to a match that is just a desperate, useless attempt, because the match ultimately smokes and goes out. It causes a fuss, but it doesn't cause a fuss in the long run. So ultimately we don't have an impact on nature overall, like over the long time. And we then have this attitude of acceptance and fatigues. I leave it at that. It's a short and sudden sentence ending, and we move on to seeing the grass reclaim its territory. In the weeks that came, new shoots like asparagus tips sprang up from its nest, and by June it was riding high in its saddle wearing a new crown. Corn in Egypt, I looked on from the upstairs window like the midday moon. By June, it wears a new crown. It comes back even stronger than before, leaving the speaker to look on like the midday moon. Armitage chooses very appropriate and unique similes here. The midday moon is always a wonder associated with the night, and here it is, forced to be here in the daylight. We can all see it, we can all point our fingers at it and say, what is it doing here? And it can't go back to the dark, it has to wait. And so it's like this image of being an outsider in his own home. He looks outside and this grass is just there, and he looks on and he is ultimately the one who becomes a stranger. Corn in Egypt is a reference to the story of Joseph from the King James Bible. So Joseph basically told the people that there would be 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine, and so the people prepared and they saved themselves. Grass will endure, so nature will endure, and it will ultimately be abundant. And there's also another biblical reference here, potentially the phrase all flesh is grass, again an implication that we could see it on a broader scale, and the grass is humanity in a way too. So again, this mix of man versus nature becoming man and nature. Back below stairs on its hook, the chainsaw ceased. I left it a year to work back through its man-made dreams, to try to forget. The seamless urge to persist was as far as it got. The chainsaw is left to cease as it retreats to its darkness, and the Pampas grass continues to enjoy the sunlight. The rich Pampas grass remains richer, perhaps even richer than before, and ultimately the chainsaw is left to retreat downstairs and to be without emotion and without attention for another year. And ultimately there's also, if we talk about this in the context of gender roles, this idea that women are stronger than we give them credit for, so women can suffer through, and it's not a good thing obviously, but they can recover, and life doesn't end just with one of those situations. Life can continue onwards. There's an implication that the violence will happen again as the speaker leaves it a year, but he also leaves it to work back through the man-made dreams, through the dreams that society imposes on them. But when it comes out, when it tries so fiercely to forget its failure, it's left with a seamless urge to persist, to continue to enact violence. But we're left with the question, for what purpose? In our desire, in our constant desire, in our seamless desire to impose our own lens and to live and to have and to be in control of nature, we ultimately forget why we're really here, and we live just for the sake of existing rather than living for the sake of living. And we seek to dominate instead of focusing on ourselves, and there's a lot of existential musings to be done in this last final line. It's a very reflective way to end the poem, to make us ask, why are we doing what we are doing? And why is humanity doomed to continue this constant cycle of violence and pointless wars? I hope you enjoyed this video and you found this analysis of all the themes and the quotes and everything helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe because it really makes a difference, and I will see you soon.